Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our summer forecast presentation. I will, as always, start slowly because people come in gradually. I can see the numbers still going up. We don't want to start without anybody. I have the pleasure to moderate today. So I am Deputy Director here, and I will moderate the presentation by Vasily Astrov, who wrote the overview and is our Russia expert, and he will present the main findings of our summer forecast for Central East and Southeast Europe, where I think, as always, there's lots to say, but maybe in different directions. So some of the relative optimism we had in the spring, it has not disappeared in Southeast Europe, but probably in a lot of the rest of the region, it has started to disappear a bit, unfortunately, and Vasily will say more about that. We also have, Vasily, as I said, is also a Russia expert. We expect plenty of questions on that, but we also have, in anticipation of likely questions, we have Meryem Gökten, who is our Turkey expert, and she will be here and she can answer any questions which come up on Turkey. And we have Olga Pindyuk, who is our Ukraine expert. And I think we can be fairly sure there will be questions for Olga. So I see now people have come in. I hope everybody is in who wants to be here. Before we start, just housekeeping, we have the question and answer or Fragen and Antworten. If you're in the German-speaking world box underneath, please post your questions there. So not in the chat. In the Q&A or F&A, depending on where you are. You can write them as we go along, type them anytime, and we will gather them and answer them at the end. And I think that, and our colleague Iulia, who's hosting the webinar, will post the presentation and also the press release from this morning as we go along. So you'll see that appear on your screens at some point as Vasily is presenting. So that's it from me. Over to you, Vasily, for the presentation. And as I said, please, as we go along, anytime, write your questions in the box. So Vasily, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. So it is my pleasure to present our forecast update for Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, which is titled Southeast Europe Motors On While the Rest of Region Struggles. So this is not the only message of our forecast, but this is one of the interesting messages, because at the moment, it really looks like this sub-region, Southeast Europe, is doing better than some other parts of Central East and Southeast Europe. In my presentation, I will talk first about the recent economic trends with an emphasis on economic growth, industry, exports, inflation and its drivers, and monetary policy and credit dynamics. So of course, these are not the only relevant topics for the region, but I think these are the ones that are the most interesting at the moment. Then, of course, I will talk about our outlook, so our projections for this year, for next year, and for 2025. And finally, I will conclude. So first, about the recent economic trends. In this chart, what you see is annual growth, so real GDP growth by sub-region. So we separate our 23 countries, so the 23 countries of Central, East and Southeast Europe, which we cover, into individual sub-regions. So we have Visegrad group and Slovenia. We have the Baltic countries. We have the this EU SEE. This stands for Southeast European EU member states, and these are 3 countries: Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Then we have the Western Balkans, and in this chart we have only 4 Western Balkan countries because we didn't have data for the first quarter for Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then we have Turkey, and we have the CIS countries. So we don't cover, as you probably know, we don't cover all the CIS countries. We cover Russia, Belarus, Moldova, and Kazakhstan. We also cover Ukraine, but Ukraine is not represented in this chart simply because the decline in real GDP last year was tremendous in Ukraine, and it would distort the whole scale. So Ukraine is not represented in this chart. But what you see here is that basically in most subregions that we are covering, there has been a progressive deceleration of economic growth on an annual basis. So the peak that you see at the beginning, of course, that was the second quarter of 2021. This was the post-COVID recovery. This is well understandable. But since then, there has been a gradual deceleration. And this deceleration in many parts of our region, it continued also in the first quarter of this year. So you see basically the economic growth was approaching zero even in some subregions. For instance, in this Visegrad group, the growth performance was very low, with countries such as Hungary, Poland, and Czechia recording negative growth in the first quarter. And in the Baltics, it was even worse. Lithuania and Estonia were in recorded negative growth, both in the first quarter of this year and also in the fourth quarter of last year. So you see a deceleration. The only exception, the only real exception is the group, the CIS group. So you see this dotted gray line, sorry. You see that there has been a rebound recently. There has been an improvement. So the growth was still negative in the first quarter, but it was, and this is basically the sanctions, digested the initial shock of the sanctions, Western sanctions that were imposed in the wake of its aggression against Ukraine. And that is basically the main explanation for this improvement in the CIS region. Now, if you look at the industrial production, you see a very similar picture. So you see, again, we have very similar subgroups here of country groupings. And again, you see a deceleration. And actually, in most countries in the first quarter of this year, industrial production turned, or the dynamics of industrial production turned negative on an annual basis. So there were many countries where industrial production was negative, and this weakness in industry, this is the main reason for the recent deceleration of growth. And this deceleration of growth in industry went hand in hand with a deceleration of growth in exports. So here you see, again, annual growth of merchandise exports on an annual basis in euro terms. And you see, again, for most regions, for most sub-regions, you have a deceleration of exports growth. So we have declining real GDP growth, we have declining growth of industrial production, actually turning negative in many countries, and we have a deceleration of exports growth. And these three, they are strongly, so to say, correlated. The only two exceptions here, or I would say outliers, special cases that you see here in this chart, which shows the dynamics of exports, are Russia and Ukraine. So this gray dotted line, this is Russia. You see there was a very big decline in exports in the first quarter of this year. This has very specific reasons. It is basically the Western energy sanctions that were imposed at the beginning of this year. In particular, the import embargo for Russian oil, which was introduced in December for crude oil and in February of this year for Russian oil products. And as a result, Russia had to divert its oil exports to Asia, where the prices are not as high. So there has been a big discount with respect to the Russian oil. So the prices of Russian oil have fallen, and this is the main reason why there has been a very substantial decline in Russian exports. And if you look at Ukraine, this is this orange dotted line. You see there was a very big decline in exports already in the second quarter of last year. Of course, it is related to the war. And by and large, this decline or this low level of exports, it continued throughout. There has been some improvement, but still there was, still you see that Ukrainian exports are not doing very well, which is not very surprising. reasons for the weakness of or for the bad dynamics of Ukrainian exports are very similar to the reasons for the GDP decline in Ukraine. These are distractions, loss of territory, loss of transportation routes, the fact that many seaports fell under Russian occupation, and it is more difficult for Ukraine to export, for instance, grain and steel. So this is a special case. Ukraine and Russia are special cases, but in the rest of the region, you see there has been a relatively minor deceleration. Why is that? The main reason is that the main export market, Germany, has been in recession. So the German economy was in technical recession in the last quarter of last year and in the first quarter of this year. So this chart shows the change in real GDP on a quarterly basis, so quarter on quarter. And you see the German economy was not doing very well, has not been doing very well. The same applies to the euro area economy, maybe not as dramatic as, not as dramatically as German economy, but you see that there has been weakness in demand, in export demand from Germany and the euro area. And why is it important? It is important because these countries are very strongly tied to, especially to Germany, in terms of trade. So these regional trade ties with Germany are very, very pronounced in the region. In this chart, you see the share of exports to Germany. So these are gross exports to Germany last year as a percentage of GDP. And you see that especially the countries on the right-hand side of this chart, first of all, the Visegrad countries, Slovenia, but also North Macedonia, actually exceptionally North Macedonia, they show a very high share of their GDP, which goes to Germany. Now, of course, this is a gross exports. This is not value added. If we did this chart in value added terms, it will be lower. But still, you see the more or less, this shows the level of dependence that between these countries and Germany. So basically, this shows why this weakness of export demand from Germany, the weakness of economic growth in Germany, the fact that the German economy has been in recession, why it had such an effect on our region. This weakness in industry, in industrial performance and exports, it's also reflected in the sentiments. So in this chart, we present the industrial confidence indicator, which is which we get from Eurostat, which is the balance of positive over negative survey results. So these are the surveys of enterprises and how they estimate the current situation and the future outlook. And you see that in most countries of the region, actually the confidence in the industrial sector is pretty weak. So especially in the Visegrad region, these are these countries which are presented on the right-hand side in the upper part of this chart. Also in the Baltics, in Southeastern Europe, with some exceptions such as Croatia, you see that the confidence in the industrial sector is very weak. So actually there is a dominance of negative expectations. The picture in the Western Balkans, which you see in the lower chart on the left, is better. And yeah, in Turkey, it is more or less close to zero. So also here you see quite a big distinction between the Central European countries and the Baltics and the Western Balkan countries. You see that the expectations in industry are much better in the latter group of countries. And this picture is very different from what we observe in services. So if you look at the services confidence indicator, which is basically a similar methodology, this is a balance of positive over negative survey results, but only for services, and it is seasonally adjusted. You see that the picture for services is actually much more optimistic. So the expectations in the services sector are much more upbeat, basically everywhere. So in almost all countries of the region, you have positive, optimistic sentiments in the services sector. So what we observe now is that there is a very big, distinction. There is a dichotomy between the industrial sector on the one hand and the services sector on the other hand. The services sector is doing much better in the region. Now I come to the next topic, which is of course very interesting and very pressing. This is the topic of inflation. Of course, as you know, in this region, there was a big increase in inflation over the past 2 years or so, for similar reasons as, for instance, in the euro area. In many countries, this increase was actually greater than in the euro area, because these are generally poorer countries, and the share of commodities such as food and energy is typically higher than, for instance, in the euro area, and that's why you had a higher increase in prices in many cases. But what we see in this chart is that the peak of inflation on an annual basis has already passed. So this peak was reached in some countries already in the second half of last year, in some countries at the beginning of this year. And since then, there has been a deceleration of price growth on an annual basis. But you also see that despite this deceleration, the annual inflation rates are still at relatively high levels, and in many cases at double-digit levels. I would say even in most cases at double-digit levels. So inflation remains still very high by historical standards. But what is interesting to see is that we had a look at the drivers of inflation, and in this chart we analyzed the development of individual subcomponents of consumer price index. So we have this core inflation, which is this orange bar. We have food, which is this dark blue, housing, which is light gray, transport, which is dark gray, and these diamonds, they represent the headline inflation rate. And we did a similar exercise last year, a bit more than 1 year ago, when we were writing our spring forecast in 2022. We did a very similar thing. And now what we do, we compare how the individual subcomponents of inflation have changed over time. So what has changed as far as the inflation drivers are concerned in the meantime, over the past year or a bit more than 1 year. And one thing that is striking is that more than 1 year ago, it was mostly energy prices that were driving inflation. Now, not anymore. Now it is food prices. So you see that in most countries of the region, it is this dark blue bar, which is the highest. So this shows the increase in food prices on an annual basis. This has been the most important driver of headline inflation. That is one thing, so the role of food prices. And the other thing is that the core inflation, so this is this headline inflation without the volatile components such as food and energy, that is the core inflation. It is now much higher than it was 1 year ago, or a bit more than 1 year ago. So this orange bar, it shows the level of core inflation. And you see that in many countries this core inflation is double digit now. So you see that there has been a massive change in the drivers of inflation over the past year. So that is the one thing that we looked at. And the other thing, we looked at what has been driving inflation, wages or profits in the region. You probably know that there was also a lot of debate about this also in other parts of the world, in the US and in the Eurozone. Was it really the wage pressures that were responsible for the recent, or let's say for the fact that inflationary pressures remained so stubborn and didn't go down as fast as maybe one could wish? or was it the profits? So greedy capitalists that are trying to, to capitalize on the new conditions and just charging more and raising their profits. And what you see in this chart is the data from the national accounts from last year. We had a look at what was the change in the wage share of GDP. That is this orange bar. So that is the change in the wage share of GDP between 2021 and 2022, and the profit share of GDP. So this dark blue bar, that is the change in the profit share of GDP. And you see that in most countries for which we have the data, in most countries of the region, there has been some redistribution of GDP from wages to profits. Yeah. So overall, this means that we don't see really a convincing evidence of a wage price spiral. So it is not so much the wage pressures that were behind the high inflation, but it was mostly the widening profit margins. So this is an interesting finding, which I think also should be reflected in the economic policy, also in the strategies of governments and national banks in fighting inflation. So it is really mostly profits and not so much wages. But of course, what we could see over the past year or the past year and a half is that there has been a very substantial tightening of monetary policy in response to the rising inflation. That is of course not really surprising, because most of these countries, or most of the countries that do not use the euro, they have inflation targets. They are formally on inflation targeting regimes. And of course, with these very high inflation rates, double-digit inflation rates in many cases, of course, these central banks, they didn't really have much choice but to tighten policy in order to try to suppress inflation. And you can see that there was, in most countries, there has been quite a substantial increase in policy interest rates, in policy rates of the central banks. Again, you see that the CIS countries, which are represented here on the right-hand side of this chart, such as Russia and Belarus and also Moldova, they have been an exception, because basically in countries such as Russia and Belarus, it was mostly so there was very, very substantial monetary policy tightening when the war started and the sanctions were introduced. They had to defend their economies against financial destabilization. Once the situation stabilized and the inflationary pressures subsided, they could afford monetary policy relaxation. But in other countries, you see it was not the case. There was a substantial tightening of monetary policy, but you also see that it looks like in many countries, this monetary policy tightening reached its plateau. So you see that the interest rates, they are now mostly, or in some cases, at least stuck at pretty high levels. Of course, this tightening of monetary policy has had an impact on credit growth, obviously. So the credit growth has been decelerating in many countries for obvious reasons. So now we have a situation where in real terms, the credit growth is negative on an annual basis in many countries. And in some countries, it is even negative in nominal terms. And that means that credit is acting now as a drag on economic growth in many countries and many sub-regions. This is the direct consequence of the monetary policy tightening. Nevertheless, what we also see is that despite this recent tightening, the real interest rates are still mostly negative. So for most sub-regions that we cover, the real interest rates are still in the negative territory. They have been rising, but they're still negative, except in Russia and Ukraine. But again, these are special cases. But in other sub-regions, the real policy rates are still in the in the negative territory. And what we think is that there are not very realistic prospects for any relaxation of monetary policy in the coming months in most of the countries that we cover, for many reasons. One reason I already mentioned, the inflation is still high in many cases, double-digit. Core inflation is in the double digits in many countries. The real interest rates are still negative. And probably most importantly is that the ECB is not finished with its tightening cycle. It indicated that it will hike interest rates more, maybe in 1 or 2 more steps, at least this year. And that means that countries in Central and Southeast Europe will not have much choice but to follow suit, because they depend on euro funding. So probably that will be the room for maneuver for them is not very large. They will not be able to relax their policy very much in the coming months. Now I come to the next section, the next chapter, to outlook. Overall, we expect an improvement in the growth performance of the region. So if you take these 23 countries that we cover, 23 countries of Central, East, and Southeast Europe as a whole, then we expect an acceleration of growth by about 1 percentage point, nearly 1 percentage point compared to last year. Last year it was particularly bad, basically because of Russia and Ukraine. And this improvement that we expect for this year is basically entirely due to the better prospects in Russia and Ukraine. So unlike last year, both Russia and Ukraine, they are projected to record positive growth. So for Russia, we expect about 1% economic growth. It may be higher, but at least 1% this year. For Ukraine, we expect 2% in the baseline scenario, which assumes that there will be no major escalation of the war, because of course for Ukraine, the forecasts are very much dependent on the assumptions with respect to the further military situation in the country. But basically, one can say that the Russian economy has by and large adjusted to sanctions now. There will be a long-term legacy of sanctions. There will be scars left, but the initial shock has been digested reasonably well. And the booming military sector is providing an important growth impetus for the Russian economy at the moment. And as far as the Ukrainian economy is concerned, it has also adjusted pretty well or reasonably well to the war conditions. And there were even some positive spots, so to say, some success stories in some Ukrainian sectors, of course, given the circumstances. So there will be an improvement in Russia and Ukraine, but in most other countries, we expect deterioration. So in the Visegrad region, in the Baltics, and in Turkey, in these 3 sub-regions, we expect a market growth slowdown, basically for 2 reasons. One reason is the weak external environment, the weak demand from Germany and the euro area and large, which I've already mentioned. We expected the euro area economy will be close to stagnation, will be almost in stagnation this year. That is one reason. And another reason is the high inflation and the tight monetary policy in the region. In Turkey, actually, the monetary policy has been already tightened after the elections and after the appointment of the new governor of the central bank, who is much more orthodox than the previous ones. And this marks a market shift in economic policy in Turkey. And it could be, or our Turkey expert expects that there will be further tightening of monetary policy in Turkey. So all this, of course, will also have an impact on economic growth. And compared to these sub-regions, Southeast Europe is actually holding up pretty well. And when I talk here about Southeast Europe, I mean not only the Western Balkans, but I also mean the EU member states, especially Romania and Croatia, which are doing pretty well. They're doing better in terms of growth performance than other countries, other East European member states, EU member states. Why is that? There are several reasons. One important reason is the large inflows of EU funds, especially within the framework of this recovery and resilience facility. So this RRF, this stands for Recovery and Resilience Facility. Of course, these are relatively poor countries, and they are allocated relatively high inflows of EU funds. So this is one reason. These EU funds, of course, they will be used especially for investment purposes, for financing green transition, digital transition, and so on. Largely. Another reason is the booming tourism. Some of the countries especially in the Western Balkans, but also Croatia, they are heavily dependent on tourism, of course. Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, tourism is doing very well. And in the case of Croatia, it will also benefit from the fact that Croatia joined both the Euro area and the Schengen area at the beginning of this year. This, of course, bodes well for tourism. The Western Balkan region has become attractive for foreign direct investment. So last year it performed very well in attracting foreign direct investment. And my colleague Branimir Jovanovic, he wrote an interesting piece in the monthly report, which was published earlier this year, which analyzing the reasons for this. It is interesting to see that actually the Southeast Europe is doing or has become really attractive for foreign direct investment, which was not necessarily the case some years ago. And also the booming remittances. So the inflow of remittances is very strong, and it is used for, of course, it's used for consumption purposes and also for investment purposes, which of course drives growth as well. But at the same time, there are question marks over Kosovo and Serbia because of the recent tensions in northern Kosovo. There is a large box in our most recent monthly report, so in our forecast report that was published as the monthly report in July. There is a long box on that written by my colleague Bernd Ström about the potential implications of these tensions in northern Kosovo for the future of Kosovo and Serbia, for their EU integration prospects, and also possibly for their attractiveness for investment. And there are serious question marks about how the situation will or will not be solved. That was for this year. For next year, for 2024 and 2025, we expect a gradual acceleration of growth, on average to between 2 and 3% on average. But there will be, in some parts of the region, there will be some factors which will be a drag on economic growth. So for instance, if we look at the Central and East European countries, at the EU member states, one such factor will be the expected fiscal consolidations. Why? Because starting from next year, the Stability and Growth Pact of the EU will be reinstated, and it will require the fulfillment of Maastricht criteria. And one of these criteria concerns the size of the budget deficit. So it requires basically the budget deficit to be below 3% of GDP. If we look at if you look at our forecasts for the size of budget deficits for this year, these are these dark blue bars. You see that in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the deficits will be higher, much higher than 3%. Actually, only 2 countries are expected to fulfill this criterion, Croatia and Lithuania. In all other countries, the deficits will be higher. So there will be probably at least some effort at fiscal consolidations, which of course will have some impact, negative impact on economic growth. And here I would like to present you our standard table with our forecasts, the so-called heat map. So those of you who have been following our webinars before, they probably have seen it before already. So the idea here is basically to show the variation in the expected growth rates with a color. So the most unfriendly colors, this dark gray and gray, this shows, they indicate the worst performance, the worst growth performance, and the best growth performance is indicated by these friendly orange colors, lively colors. And you see that, for instance, for this year, there is quite a big variation in expected economic growth. On the one hand, we have a country like Hungary, that is the only country of the region that we cover, which will be in a recession for this year. We expect a recession for the year as a whole for Hungary. Basically, for two reasons. Hungary has the highest inflation rate in Central Europe, which eats into the real purchasing power of households. That is one reason. And the second reason is the delays in the EU transfers, which are, of course, related to the standoff between Prime Minister Orban and the European Commission. So these two factors, basically, they explain why the economic dynamics in Hungary is expected to be particularly bad this year. But you see that in other Central European countries, also the situation is not much better, with some exceptions, such as Romania and Croatia. In the Western Balkans, the situation is generally better. I already spoke about the reasons. And in the CIS countries, you see that they will not be in a recession anymore. All of them are expected to show positive economic growth, and above all, Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is the country that is expected to be a star performer this year in terms of economic growth, basically, or to a large extent due to the large-scale investment projects which are implemented in this country. So quite a bit of a variation across countries. For the next 2 years, we expect a better growth performance. So you see that there will be acceleration of growth in many cases. The colors are becoming much more friendly. And that is very much related to the expected slowdown in inflation. So here we have a similar heat map, but only for inflation. So not for growth, but for expected consumer price inflation. Only that the colors here are the opposite. So low inflation means lively orange colors, and high inflation means high inflation is shown by dark gray colors, such as in Turkey. And you see that for the next 2 years, we expect a gradual disinflation. So this acceleration of economic growth and disinflation will go hand in hand, and they are, of course, mutually compatible. So finally, I come to the conclusions. What are the main conclusions of our forecast update? One thing is that we see a market growth slowdown in most countries of the region, with the exception of the CIS and Ukraine, which were in a crisis last year and which are recovering now for different reasons. The recession in Germany weighs heavily on economic growth in many parts of the region, but especially in the Visegrad countries and other Central European countries, which are heavily dependent on the economic dynamics in Germany. Southeast Europe, that means Western Balkans and the EU member states from Southeast Europe, they are performing better than the rest for the reasons that I have already mentioned. The peak of inflation has already passed, but inflation remains high. And inflation has been largely profit-led, so that there is very little evidence of a wage price spiral in the region. But since the inflation is so high, or remains at high levels, tight monetary policy would likely stay in the region at least until the end of this year, in many countries, with some exceptions, such as Hungary. And this tight monetary policy will dampen the dynamics of credit and, of course, also the GDP growth. So this is more or less the messages that I have for our forecast update. If you have any questions, so please ask. And if you have any comments, yes, please ask. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasily, for this very comprehensive overview. There's really a lot to say, a lot going on in the region, and I think also many divergent stories. So as you said at the start, you know, we have the title about Southeast Europe, and that's something we want to emphasize, a rather positive story there. But it was really difficult, I think, this time to have a title which really summarized everything that we're seeing in the region, because there are some good things happening or positive things to report, but also a lot of challenges as well. And it's not clear which tendency is going to win out at the moment. We already have 2 questions in the chat, and we will start with those, but I would encourage everybody else who's here to please type your questions into the chat, and we will answer them. So we have 2 questions, one on the Western Balkans, one on Ukraine and Russia. I'll actually start with the second one, especially because Vasily and Olga are here. So this is from Paula Tama. She asks, can we expand on the assumptions we make for the evolution of the conflict in Ukraine when forecasting GDP in Ukraine and Russia? So Olga, Vasily, either of you, you can start.
Let me start.
Yeah.
I think since I was writing the report for Ukraine, well, we are rather general in our assumptions because we do not have specific military knowledge, understanding of how the war will develop. We can only get information from the open sources. What we assume is that there will be no major escalation of the war this year, and that the war will be gradually getting localized in terms of its impact, military activities. So there will be decreasing effect on the economic activity from the war during the next years. We are very cautious not to make any explicit assumptions about the duration of the war. This is as far as we go. And I just would need to stress again that focus for Ukraine is subject to really many primarily downside risks because there are so many unexpected things which can happen. An example of dam in Kherson comes to mind. No one can predict it, especially among the economists. Now there are worries about the nuclear station in Zaporizhia. So, if everything goes well, then that's what we predict. Thanks.
Thank you, Olga. Just to summarize, before we go to Vasily, just to highlight, I mean, the general assumption we have for all the countries that we work off for the forecast is, as Olga said, the war won't end this year, but it will become increasingly localized and there will be no major escalation. And those assumptions are important because, for example, our colleague Marina has been doing some work on the demographics of this. And if there's an escalation, she models that will have a huge impact. A lot more people will leave, for example. So it's both the duration of the war, so no quick end to the war, but also that we don't get a major escalation, that it doesn't develop on a lot more of Ukrainian territory than is currently the case. And of course, there are risks to that, as Olga said, a lot of uncertainty. And if these expectations don't play out, then the forecast will change as well. But maybe, Vasily, you want to add something on this?
Yes, I would like to add a few words on Russia. Actually, the impact of the war on the Russian economy is ambiguous, because the fact that the Russian economy is at war, it gives impetus to the military sector. So there is a lot of military production going on. It's not only military goods, tanks and so on themselves and drones, but also, for instance, textile industry, the pharmaceutical industry, which are also to a large extent dependent on what's going on in the war, in the battlefields. And basically, the longer the war lasts, the longer this, the more need there will be for military production. So from that point of view, actually, the war is not so bad for the Russian economy. What we could see is that since part of the labor force was diverted to the front because of the partial mobilization that was announced last year in September. So part of the labor force actually went to the war, and part of the labor force escaped the country because in order to avoid subscription. What we see is that there are labor shortages in many sectors of the Russian economy. The unemployment rate is at the historical low, and it is an it is a constraint on economic growth in some sectors, but at the same time, it is also a paradoxical situation because the fact that the labor is so scarce in many sectors, it is also an important wage driver. So the real wages are growing relatively strongly in Russia, and this is a factor which is good for the growth of private consumption. So all in all, the impact of the war on the Russian economy is very, very ambiguous, I would say.
Thank you, Vasily. So we have another question from Claire Nuttall on the Western Balkans. So Vasily, you talked about the situation between Serbia and Kosovo as a factor for growth, a negative factor for growth. And as you said, we have a nice box on that in the report. Are we also concerned about the situation within Bosnia? And is that affecting investment and growth? So I guess I should at least try to answer this. So, I mean, the country report on Bosnia, the view we took in our Bosnia expert, Selena, who's unfortunately not here, her view was that, so 8 months after the election, governments were formed, and that's a positive sign, and especially because, at least at some levels of government, there's been a reduction in the nationalist presence. So in general, rather positive assessment until the recent news from Republika Srpska. Of course, you know, if foreign investors perceive secession as a realistic possibility, that's naturally going to affect investment perceptions towards Republika Srpska, but I think Bosnia and possibly also the wider region. It's not, of course, something that we see now. I mean, you wouldn't see a change in investor decisions so quickly. And overall, as Vasily said, Branimir, our colleague, has been writing that in general, things are going pretty well in this sense in the Western Balkans. So the fundamentals seem to be rather positive. Investors are interested in the region. We've been working also on nearshoring perceptions. People are interested in the region. It's a rather positive story. But of course, these two major, you know, the two major political challenges of the region, Kosovo, Serbia, and within Bosnia-Herzegovina, both seem to be going in a rather negative direction at the moment. And if that continues, it has at least quite a risk that it will affect investor perceptions towards those countries and possibly towards the region as a whole. Vasily, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
No. It's okay.
We have another question from Franz Lothar Altmann. Thank you for the question. On greedflation or profit-led inflation. I don't well understand what you mean. Isn't it rather that profits rise due to inflation if producers raise their prices? And then he adds, or do you mean that inflation goes up because producers claim higher prices? I mean, this greedflation is very interesting. I should say we had, it's associated, I think, above all, this idea with Isabella Weber, who we were very happy to host at WW recently. But Vasily, you can say more on the CEE context of this.
Well, yeah, basically, one can see at what has been driving inflation, wages or profits, because if you look at GDP at market prices consists of aggregate wages, aggregate profits, and net taxes on production. Yeah, so basically, you can have a look at what has there been a redistribution from wages to profits or from profits to wages, and what I was trying to show in this chart and what has been the redistribution of GDP between profits and wages. Yeah, what we observe is that there is high inflation. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but there has been high inflation, especially because there has been a widening of profit margins, and not so much because of the wage pressures. Because if we had a situation when it was primarily wage pressures that were responsible for high inflation, that we would see the opposite picture. We would see a rising share of wages in GDP and a falling share of profits. But this is not what we see. We see the opposite. We see the rising share of profits and the falling share of wages in most countries, not everywhere, but in most countries, this is what we see. So it looks like that. It looks like the firms are taking advantage of the situation for whatever reason. of this inflationary environment to raise their profit margins, and they get away with that. What would be the appropriate policy in these circumstances? I would say appropriate policies would be first competition policies, to wherever possible to reduce the degree of monopolization in order to get rid of these excess profits, to reduce these profit margins, which have to be paid by the consumers in the end. That is on the one hand, and on the other hand, wherever it's not possible or wherever it's difficult to implement a competitive environment, one needs to regulate prices. So these energy monopolies, in the end, they have to be regulated. Also, many countries, as you know, they resorted to price controls for food products in many countries. And for instance, our colleague Branimir, he did a study on analyzing the effects of price controls in the Western Balkan countries. And he came to the conclusion that these effects have been basically beneficial. So the price controls, they made sense. They were effective by and large. I'm simplifying a little bit, but this was one of the main messages. So this worked pretty well. Yeah, so that's from my side.
Thanks, Vasily. So we have another question from Olena Tsiopko. I hope I said that right. It's a question to you, Vasily, but I think we can also put this to Miriam, our Turkey expert is here. So she asks, you mentioned orthodox policies in Turkey. Could you clarify your understanding of orthodox economic policies? But I would add a sub-question to that, if I may, also to Miriam, because I mean, I think we've seen a change in monetary policy in Turkey recently, which I think most of us would understand as more orthodox than anything we'd seen in the previous 18 months or 2 years or whatever. But I think what's interesting, or an open question is this what we've seen in the past, where it's not really a return to what we would understand as orthodoxy? It's a short-term measure to relieve balance of payments pressure, and it will be unwound, by next year. Or do you think really, because of the change in personnel, finance ministry, central bank, that this really a new era of, we can discuss how we define it, but of something more orthodox than we have seen for a lot of the last decade, pretty much in Turkey?
Yes, Vasily, do you want to go first, or should I? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So the first question is, I don't know if Vasily, do you want to also answer? So the orthodox policies is just these like the abandoning low interest rates focused policy, which is also means that the growth, like focusing on much more growth, but especially credit driven or borrowing driven growth. So what we see lastly is that with the personal changes in the central bank and the finance ministry, but also like the recent decisions such as like the hiking the inflation rate to 15%, and also underlining that the hikes is gonna continue. So that's what we are also like the government itself is saying this is the return to orthodoxy. The question of the Richard's question about if it's going to continue or not, actually we have already some signs. I think the first sign is that the speeches of the president himself, he already underlines a couple of times he's still not on board fully with the changes. So which means that we might see in the future, I don't know, like maybe in 1 year, or like it might come just before the next year municipality elections, or around the time that the policy, the interest rate hike might be stopped, and and actually they might start cutting the interest rate again. So that's one of the first sign that this monetary tightening is not going to continue. The second sign is that, of course, like when we look at the past, we had this same episode twice in 2018 and 2020. So there was also personal changes and like a brief policy changes too. So but those two changes didn't last long, and also again at this time around there is no acknowledgement of the policy failure of the past. So which means that I am at least not very hopeful that these like the monetary tightening or the return to the orthodoxy is gonna last long. I think they are gonna see, or like they are waiting to see if the investors are gonna believe in the changes, because like after the initial rate hike, most of the investors were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the hike, and which also like we saw in the deep depreciation of the Turkish lira. So in the next, I think until the end of the year, we are gonna see how much they are gonna hike. What we are assuming is that they are gonna hike till 25, and then how much the investors are gonna buy into it. But I don't think this is gonna be a new era. Let's say.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Vasily, you want to add anything on that?
No.
Okay. We have another question from Blerin Morina. And by the way, before we go to this, I see lots of people are still here. If you have questions, please don't be shy to write them in the chat. But I will try to answer this one first. So, on relations between Serbia and Kosovo, the impact this will have on the process of Western Balkan integration. I guess that means both within the region, regional cooperation, and also with the EU, probably more importantly, and solutions to overcome this potential conflict within the country. So, I mean, I think as economists, we cannot offer any sort of revolutionary ideas on how to solve conflicts, but I mean, I think what's clear is that the change through trade approach, which, you know, has been heavily criticized in relation to Russia, I would say still has some validity in relation to the Western Balkans, but this is not a conflict that can be solved via change through trade. I mean, this requires very strong EU and US involvement in mediation. I think that's clear. I mean, the Western Balkan integration into the EU in general, I think it's actually a very interesting time. I've just come from an event at the Austrian Foreign Ministry on this, and clearly the invasion of Ukraine and Ukraine's EU integration has implications for the Western Balkans as well. And I don't think it means that any country is going to join anytime soon, but my impression is that the idea of phased integration of the Western Balkans into the EU, which we and many others have been arguing for many years now, is really much more on the table in Brussels than it was in the past. And I think there's much more concrete thought now about different ways that the Western Balkans can be integrated more into the single market, can have more access to the EU budget, can be involved in other EU policy schemes on the way to accession than was the case in the past. And I mean, if that happens, if we go in that direction, can certainly be positive for the region in an economic sense. We've always shown in papers we've done how much a bit more EU economic integration in this region would really change the dynamics of the region economically. The whole region is 1% of EU GDP. It would not take that much in order to have quite an impact. And I think what's positive, while we have to, you know, the situation in Bosnia, the situation between Serbia and Kosovo is very concerning. On the other hand, we do see this greater energy from Brussels to reinvigorate the process. And basically this holding strategy of the last decade where enlargement has gone nowhere, I think it will change now. It has to change. And that, you know, if you combine it with the FDI story that we've already talked about, which our colleague Branimir has been writing about, the more, you know, the region's ability to continue to attract FDI, we can see some positives, I think, for the region, or at least the possibility of some positives in an economic sense for the region. And Vasily highlighted already this general story of Southeast Europe, which is doing better. You know, in all areas really, Southeast Europe is the bright spot in the European economy at the moment. There are many things that are going right in this region that are not in the rest of the region, but all of this doesn't change, you know, these really tough political questions of the region, and that, you know, that economics cannot solve. That needs the EU, and I would say also the US, to take a much stronger role. I don't know, Vasily, if you want to add anything. Okay, I do not see any other questions in the chat. We have reached an hour as well, but you know, type quickly if anybody has any final questions. We can take them. If not, I think we can bring it to a close. I would say thank you to Vasily for the excellent presentation, to Vasily, Miriam, and Olga for being here and answering the questions. Thank you to the audience for the great questions. It's always really nice to have this event. It kind of brings to a close our forecast cycle, and we're very happy to do it. And in the background, you don't see them, but to Iulia and Magdalena, thanks for the seamless, as always, excellent organization. So we'll be back in the autumn with our main forecast update. We'll present it here as normal. We very much look forward to seeing you then. We hope we'll have some better news for the rest of the region outside of Southeast Europe to report. And as I have been talking, so a couple of messages, but saying thank you. So wish you all a nice summer, and yeah, look forward to seeing you back here in the autumn. Bye for now.